Hello, this is Ryan Donovan, and this is my research presentation. Please bear with me, I have a little bit of a sinus thing going on, but my presentation will be on adverse childhood experiences and special education. So, what are ACEs? ACEs is short for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and I'm just going to move through the research in an order that I feel makes the most sense, starting with the deepest well, healing the long-term effects of childhood adversity. Written by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is the founder of the San Diego Center for Youth Wellness. This is a book about the detrimental effects of ACEs. ACEs are well documented, going all the way back to the original ACEs study conducted in 1998. It is recognized by the CDC as a predisposition to a host of health conditions, and her clinic was one of the first in the United States to not only screen for ACEs, but to provide counseling and family support to treat the health effects resulting from childhood adversity. So, ACEs are adverse childhood events that can basically trigger the body's stress response in a disproportionate way, more than what would be considered normal. And if you look at Appendix 1 on the right, you will see that here we actually have an ACE screening test. This is the one that is in the appendix of Nadine Burke-Harris's book, and questions include things such as, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? Another one, I'm not going to go through all of them, but did you often feel that no one in the family loved you, or thought that you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? All the way down to, were your parents ever separated or divorced? And the way that an ACEs screening would work is that the patient would be given the screening, they would fill out each of the things, and then at the bottom they would add up their score. Now, the person administering the examination would not actually ever see this sheet of paper. To protect the patient's privacy, the patient would add up the score and then simply tell their healthcare provider what the score is. This is to ensure honesty and to ensure that there isn't any unnecessary awkwardness in conducting an ACE screening. So, how does this affect a person's mental and physical health? The body's stress system can become dysregulated when it is activated too frequently or over a long period of time. Deployment of stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline is perfectly normal. It can even be healthy. It's what helps you wake up in the morning. It's what motivates you to study for a test. It's what gets you out of the way of a car that's coming at you. But if the body's stress system is activated multiple times a day, the normal amount would be about a dozen times a day. When it is being activated dozens to hundreds of times a day, it begins to overproduce these stress hormones, which can lead to imbalances in other hormones, which can lead to developmental delays and predisposition to a host of other mental and physical health conditions, which I will cover in later slides. That's a doozy of a title for an article, but adverse childhood experiences and their relationship to complex health profiles among welfare-involved children. This was a study that hoped to identify particular clusters of adverse childhood experiences, which were the ones that you saw in the appendix on the ACE screening, that might best characterize child welfare-involved children with known complex health concerns. So these are children who are already in the welfare system, who are likely or already statistically likely to have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And these researchers basically wanted to see, are there any particular adverse childhood experiences they tend to encounter, that they tend to encounter in groups, and how can we best address those particular clusters of adverse childhood experiences? There is no one-size-fits-all solution to treating children who have experienced ACEs. So the study used a cross-section of data from Wave 1 of the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being, and the results indicated that children who experience physical abuse alone, as well as experiencing physical abuse combined with having a caregiver with a mental illness, are most strongly associated with complex health concerns. The health concerns of children were affected not only by the presence of ACEs, but by the combinations of ACEs present in their lives, suggesting that specialized approaches are necessary to address students who have faced serious adversity. The importance of this research is that it demonstrates we cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach to treating children, particularly students, from the perspective of an educator who have ACEs. The type of traumatic experience the child has encountered is going to require a unique solution. You cannot just slap a Band-Aid on adverse childhood experiences. Beyond Complex Trauma, an existential view of adverse childhood experiences. This was an article written to aid humanistic counselors in helping those who suffer from ACEs. This article chronicled a lot of the direct correlations between ACEs and serious health concerns, backed up by a large body of research. The annotations on this are like about 2 or 3 pages of just sources. So this article not only offers a chronicle of proven physical and mental health detriments, such as lower self-rated health. This is the patient reporting how they physically feel on a day-to-day basis. So lower self-rated health means that this patient is not feeling well. Poor heart health, obesity, elevated basal cortisol production. That's the stress hormone that is responsible for triggering the stress mediation system in your body. And as I said before, constantly activating this stress response more than often or more severely than often can lead to adverse health effects, such as hardened arteries, heightened blood pressure, and a predisposition to diabetes. ACEs have also been linked with mental health concerns such as depression, PTSD, disassociation, and suicidality. It was found in a sample of 130 juvenile detainees that 75% of them had at least one ACE, 30-something% of them had at least 2 or more ACEs, and I believe about 20% had 3 or more ACEs. So there is definitely a correlation between physical and mental health concerns combined with ACEs. I would never have been able to look at every single learning disability in relation to ACEs, so I decided instead to focus on one. I focused on autism spectrum disorder, and some of the research I found is actually very interesting. So, delayed diagnosis and treatment among children with autism who experience adversity. So, oftentimes children suffering from a dysregulated stress response can be misdiagnosed with a learning disability or other behavioral issue. In my research, I found the most common misdiagnosis is misdiagnosing a child who has experienced trauma with ADHD or ADD, because a lot of the symptoms of a dysregulated stress response, the hypervigilance, inability to stay focused on a task, frequent outbursts, aggression towards fellow students, these can look like ADD and ADHD, but can really be a symptom of a dysregulated stress response. An example I've heard is reacting to a paper tiger, a drawing of a tiger, as if there were actually a tiger in a room. It's a disproportionate stress response caused by an elevated level of basal cortisol production. In cases where a learning disability or mental illness exists in addition to ACEs, it can be very hard to differentiate between the two. Take, for example, a child who happens to have ADD and has experienced adverse childhood events, or a child who experienced adverse childhood events and now has ADD as a result of those events. In the case of autism, the link between autism and adversity has very interesting results. It was found that over half of all participants in the study had at least one ACE, with 20% of participants reporting 3 or more, which actually indicates that just by having autism alone, you are statistically more likely to have encountered a childhood adversity. The second finding is interesting, which is that individuals with ASD are at a disproportionate risk of adversities that may contribute to disparities in access to diagnoses and therapeutic services. An example of this that I saw was one of the most common ACEs that people with autism spectrum disorder are predisposed to is a divorce in the family. That is one of the ACEs that shows up on the screening tests. It is apparently over 50% of respondents in this study had a divorce of their parents while they were a child, which could lead to lapses in care. Maybe children missing doctor's appointments, missing appointments with therapists, maybe not getting medications that they need when they need them. So, not only are children who have autism spectrum disorder more likely to have ACEs, those ACEs are more likely to interfere with their ability to get care for their condition. The relationship between adverse childhood events, resiliency, and health among children with autism. So this study classified resilience as the ability to bounce back from a traumatic life event. I did not know that resilience was a clinical term, but in this study it was very much used that way. Shockingly, what the study concluded is that children with autism are statistically much more likely than their peers to have experienced adversity in their lives, which goes with the first study that I mentioned on autism and adversity. Parents of students with autism reported higher levels of stress than parents of students without disabilities or with other disabilities. This heightened level of stress on the caregivers could possibly explain the excessive presence of ACEs in the lives of students with autism. The study also found, more importantly, that adversity did not affect the large majority of participants who had autism the same way that it affected their peers. With most children in the study, there was a positive correlation between the number of adverse experiences and a decline in resilience. So, as the ACE score rose, the child's reported resilience, which can be, it is an ability to bounce back from traumatic life events. So, the way that this was measured was outlook on life, how they reflect on past events, how they reported past events, and how they reported on themselves, their general worth, their capabilities, etc. So, with the regular population of students, there was a positive correlation. As the number of ACEs increased, that positive outlook and positive self-image decreased. With autistic children, however, there was not nearly as strong of a correlation, leading Riggles to believe that they process traumatic events differently than their peers. This is important because it means that not only would screening a student with autism for ACEs present special challenges, but that specific strategies would be needed to address all of the student's needs. One hypothesis that Riggles proposed, although she didn't reach anything conclusive in her study, is that because children who suffer from autism tend to withdraw and sort of almost have their own inner world, that might lead them to possibly disassociate from traumatic events, to process those traumatic events in a different way or not to the full extent that somebody without autism might. Students who suffer from autism often do suffer from difficulties processing their emotions in the same way as other children, so this could also be a possible explanation. The root of the problem. So, adverse childhood experiences and suicide attempts. This research article examined the link between risk factors for suicide, which are, most interestingly to an educator, impulsivity, aggression, and school difficulties, but also self-reports of suicidal thoughts. And their connection to ACEs using a large population of juvenile offenders in the state of California. The prevalence of ACEs among juvenile offenders was found to be disproportionately high compared to their peers, with over 83% of students reporting at least one ACE or higher. Additionally, traits such as aggression and impulsivity were found to be heightened in participants who reported higher ACE scores. There's actually a positive correlation found between the number of ACEs and reports of aggressive or impulsive behavior among these students. So, all of the students who reported ACEs also reported difficulties in school and were more likely to abuse substances. The study highlights the importance of addressing and preventing the negative effects of childhood adversity to prevent not only adolescent suicide, but the development of negative behavior and personality traits. Why this is important if you are an educator is because it means not all students who are presenting difficulties in school or the hallmarks of other learning disabilities, such as the impulsivity, the aggression, they may not necessarily have a learning disability. They may actually be suffering from a dysregulated stress response as a result of ACEs, or they may be suffering from negative personality and behavioral traits that developed as a result of childhood trauma. So, treating them as if they are any other student with a learning disability or mental illness might not be the most effective strategy to address their specific needs. Understanding and promoting resilience in the context of adverse childhood experiences. This article builds on previous research into the negative effects that toxic stress can have on the brain during the early years of development. As Safara and colleagues say, from the earliest months of life, the body and brain respond and adapt to various stimuli and stressors. This can be negative and positive. The article goes on to explain that there are 3 types of stress, which is something I touched on earlier, but now I'm going to go into much more detail on. There is positive stress. This is an activation of the stress response that can lead to positive feelings. This is what motivates us to achieve, to grow, to try new things, to push ourselves. There is tolerable stress, which is something that I think any adult can relate to. Tolerable stress is not necessarily positive in the sense that it does not feel good, but it is not anything outside of the norm, and it is not anything that would cause any negative long-term effects. Tolerable stress is crunching for that big test that you have. It is being nervous about the presentation you have to give. It is going through a nasty breakup. It is unpleasant, but it is nothing that would cause an imbalance in the release of stress hormones. Finally, there is toxic stress. This is chronic, uncontrollable, and overtaxes the body's stress management system. This is when you have constant production of adrenaline and cortisol, which raises your body's basal level of these hormones. There's a certain level that your body is supposed to have. It is supposed to peak in the morning and slowly taper off into the evening. When you have a dysregulated stress response, there is no taper effect, and the basal level where it starts at the beginning of the day may be much higher than a normal person's. This can lead to sleep difficulties. This can lead to irritability, hypervigilance, anxiety. And the disruption of the body's stress response can even affect brain development in the early years of development. The release of hormones and even shape long-term genetic outcomes. How your genes code themselves throughout your lifetime can actually be permanently altered by the results of toxic stress in the early years of development. Therefore, it is entirely possible that dysregulated stress responses can mimic learning disabilities or be the direct cause of certain learning disabilities that impact learning capabilities. So, as an educator I teach middle school, there isn't much that this research has to contribute to me or inform my teaching. But anybody who works in preschool, for example, this might be invaluable knowledge. If you know that a child is experiencing ACEs and you know that they are in that critical window of development, it would be a perfect time to intervene either in the classroom, through family services, or other means. Appropriate intervention. So, creating trauma-informed systems. This was a 3-part article on how different child-centered services, such as child welfare, education, first responders, healthcare, and juvenile justice, might tailor their approaches to meet the needs of children suffering from traumatic stress. The article was published by the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress, and it outlines best practices. So, I only read one part of this 3-part article, and I've specifically focused on the education aspect because that's what I was most interested in for my research. The biggest takeaway as an educator is the suggestion that, thanks to laws such as No Child Left Behind and the Individuals with Disabilities Acts, there are new pathways to providing services that can specifically address ACEs that maybe did not exist in the 20th century. Discretionary school counseling grants, grants for the integration of schools with mental health systems, and Safe Schools Healthy Students grants are now easily accessible by most districts. These provide funding and resources to create more trauma-informed classrooms, train staff on trauma-informed care, and to provide resources to families of students who have suffered traumatic events in their lives. Additionally, the study concluded that special educators have the potential to be partners in developing trauma-informed assessments and interventions. This is mostly because they have the knowledge already and because they are in the unique position of already tending to students who are having special learning difficulties in the classroom. So this is an idea of almost creating an integrated classroom that integrates special education approach with the trauma-informed approach to create a situation where all students can learn best. Understanding adversity and peer crowds to prevent youth health risks. This study was most important for my research because it showed that a correlation can be made between certain peer groups, self-selected peer groups, the students that other students choose to hang out with, how they self-identify, can be linked to certain ACEs and can be used to inform educators who are trying to tailor an approach to specific students or to specific adverse childhood experiences. This study focused on how to identify which adolescent peer crowds are at a higher risk of having ACEs and which ACEs might be emblematic of certain self-selected peer crowds. The study used a cross-section of data from adolescents in the Southwest United States between 2017 and 2018, and their measures were the ACE screening that I showed in previous slides, identification with 5 peer crowds. This was mainstream, popular, hip-hop, country, and alternative, and reported health risks. The study found that ACEs and health risks cluster in certain adolescent peer crowds, primarily hip-hop and alternative. This provides initial evidence that a peer crowd targeted intervention incorporating trauma-informed practices to address risks resulting from ACEs. Basically what they're saying is, if you know that these ACEs cluster around certain groups of peers, certain students who all cluster together and all are at a higher risk for having these ACEs, that can inform how you screen for ACEs, who you choose to screen for ACEs, and how you address those specific ACEs, because you already know what peer crowd a student who presents these ACEs probably identifies with. The evidence in the article points to the fact that schools need to be doing more to be implementing individualized policies and procedures to address child adversity. As I warned earlier in previous slides, you cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing childhood trauma. Each student is unique, each trauma is unique. But this study makes an excellent first step in identifying specific strategies that might work with specific groups of students. Sorry. Building writing hope through the process of nexting. Many of the articles that this presentation covered suggest that the ill effects of ACEs and suggest ways that schools can assist families through intervention and how classrooms can be structured to provide stability. But what I was really looking for, and I was glad I found this last article, was I wanted to see if there was a way to integrate a trauma-informed approach into the writing and ELA classroom, because I am an ELA teacher. And what I found was that there is a way. This article focused on integrating hope into the English language arts curriculum by treating hope as a theme that can be covered in writing exercises as any other literary theme might. Hope is present in many types of literature already. It is a common theme in most fiction, and it is a theme that can be easily worked with on writing prompts. The researcher, Sibin, claimed that there are many hope moments that can occur in the classroom, either naturally, organically, or through pre-planning by the instructor. So, she categorized these into 3 specific types of moments. A motivational moment is when a student is given a sudden surge of agency and freedom in expression. This is basically a free write type activity. You give a student a prompt, or you just tell them to write about anything, and the idea is that giving them the freedom to write about this, anything, it might be something that they hope for, it might be something that they're coping with at home, it gives them the freedom to express themselves, which increases their motivation to want to participate and write and grow their writing skills. A cognitive moment is when a student makes a serious gain in writing strategies. A large part of the article focused on how students' confidence and hope in their own capabilities can be boosted by basically charting their gains periodically. The process of nexting, as Sibin describes it, is instead of focusing on where the student is currently at in relation to their peers or in relation to being at or above or below grade level, instead you focus on where was the student's writing ability at, where is their writing ability going, and where can they eventually be. So each time a student submits an assignment, instead of focusing on how possibly below grade level their writing abilities are, you want to focus on how much their writing ability has improved compared to last week, last month, last year. Basically, by changing the metric of comparison, you can create motivation for the student to continue to try for better and to feel confident in their writing capabilities. A spontaneous moment can occur anytime and should be encouraged if a student makes an interesting connection. For example, if they're reading a book and one of the characters in the book has a family member that dies and a student makes a connection to a family member of theirs that has died, that should be encouraged and accepted and promoted in the classroom. One of the best ways to treat ACEs is through compassion and understanding and providing emotional buffering, as many of my sources confirmed. But teachers should also plan specific moments for hope in their classroom that tie into the reading materials and writing goals that already exist in the curriculum. One thing that Sibin really stressed is that curriculums do not need to change to make these accommodations. It is very easy to work them into the curriculum. many children's books that would be read in schools already are going to explore the theme of hope. It's just a matter of the teacher sussing that out for the class and encouraging them to engage with it. And here we have a list of my sources. I'm not going to go through each individual one, but they're included in the presentation if you'd like to do any further reading. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and have a good, I guess for me it's evening, so have a good evening.